Shida's arms quivered a bit, with her breath stuck in her throat, as her eyes were furiously focused onto the barrel rack that was situated above her chest. Gritting her teeth, she pressed onward, feeling the burn in her chest, arms and shoulders, as the weights and the steel bar in her hands rattled from the shaking of her arms. Soon after, scratching against the storage's rungs, as she got it just to the verge of pushing the darn thing over into the safety of the hold. 2 pairs of hands, for a total of 4, hovered just underneath the heavily shaking bar, ready to come in and lift it in case she would stumble at the finish line, though the eyes of the hand's owners were focused down at her with a burning determination, spurring her on to push it and get there all by herself. Push it. It echoed in her mind, both from their earlier words and those of times long past, all the way back when she had first started to be among humans. Push it, they told her, urging her to keep going, urging her not to stop, urging her to go to her limits. Push it! With an almost primal noise escaping her chest, the feline released the breath that had been burning in her lungs, as her torso was slightly lifted up from the tension in the muscles of her chest and shoulders while she pushed, her ears finally twitching as they heard the satisfying clank of the bar scraping over the edge, securely falling down into the hold almost immediately, as her muscles slumped once her eyes had quickly confirmed that it was, in fact, fully secure. Her arms now hung past both sides of her head, the heat of her own body radiating towards her face, while her ears were filled with the noise from the rushing of her own blood. Her chest rose and sank heavily, as she was deeply gasping for air, her eyes closing for a moment as her brain threatened to shut down for a second due to sensory overload. With the immediate burning gone, her arms felt mostly numb right now, but she knew that pain would return with a vengeance once her body had fully realized that it wasn't about to be crushed by some enormous weight. While her eyes were still closed, she felt 2 hands tap on her shoulders in a congratulatory way. "Way to go," Admir said, his enthusiastic patting gradually morphing into a firm rub back and forth along her now slightly swollen muscles. "Almost back at your personal best. Looks like your muscle retention isn't having any of the low-gravity shit anymore." The man gave a hearty chuckle. Shida couldn't help but smirk. Even though the situation was hardly comparable to the one that led to her atrophy-emaciated state, which she had unknowingly suffered during her early career in Scale, the idea was slightly reassuring that her body now remembered that it would have to stay ready for higher gravities, even if she left them for a bit. Even if that idea was maybe just wishful thinking on her part. Meanwhile, on her other side, Sam let out a bit of a mock pouting huff. "Yeah, just keep widening the gap, will you?" she non-seriously complained, as she pulled her own hand back and stood back up to her full height, the sound of the movement causing Shida to finally open her eyes again as she looked up at the tall woman, the gaze of her yellow eyes meeting with Sam's blues. "Bad enough that you're already way out of reach in what you excel in, but now you're suddenly starting to gain stamina as well?" Shida huffed in mild amusement, knowing that the captain's words were meant as the exact opposite of a backhanded compliment. Briefly, the feline tried to push herself up to at least meet the woman's gaze on a somewhat more even level. However, her aching muscles quickly informed her that that wouldn't be happening anytime soon, and she quickly crashed back down onto the padded bench. "Flattering, but also just blatantly wrong," Shida chuckled, once her first painful groan had subsided, and she shifted her shoulders a bit, so at the very least none of her skin was pinched under her weight. "I don't think the point will ever come when you can't run circles around me for literal hours after I'm already long wheezing on the ground." She tried to lift her arm up to wipe some sweat away from her brow, only for the motion to only half succeed, ultimately resulting in her own hand nearly smacking herself in the face, had she not managed to somewhat catch it and roll her head out of the way just in time. "Case and point," she chuckled at her own clumsy motion. Sam and Admir also chuckled in return, with the latter going through the effort of picking up Shida's towel, which lay close by, and using it to pat down her forehead gently. Wondering for a moment if she found this helpful or embarrassing, Shida ultimately decided that she was far past the point of having these sorts of hang-ups with any of the team's humans, as she gratefully closed her eyes. And her conscious decision was quickly aided by the not-quite-so-conscious yet much more telling fact that a very gentle purr emerged from her chest as it went on. As she began to relax and her heavy breathing also started to somewhat calm down, her ears twitched a bit as the rushing noise within them quietened down, just enough for her to begin consciously picking up on the other noises in the gym once again, namely the heavy clacking of polymer against polymer. She tilted her head slightly and opened one of her eyes again, just enough to glance over in the direction of the source of the noises. To her slightly blurry vision, the men looked like two dark shadows as they were dancing around each other, clad in protective black armor that shielded them from the worst of each other's strikes, should an unlucky one actually manage to land in a bad spot. They both held training swords in one hand, pointed towards each other while their other side was directed away from their opponent. The dark figures gradually circled each other, testing out each other's guards with quick taps against the other's blade. Only every now and then, one of the two would suddenly commit to an attack, resulting in the quick clacking of weapon against weapon, as fractions of a moment decided if push or guard would win out by the end, with a single clean touch of the tip or blade deciding who had won out in the exchange. That particular time, as Sheeta looked over, it was the taller of the two figures, who she knew to be James, who committed to an attack, moving towards his opponent with a few quick steps as his blade moved forth with a strike that seemed to slither underneath the shorter man's guard. Although she herself had limited experience with sword fighting on every conceivable level, Sheeta had watched those two spar often enough by now to quickly see that James's advance was probably doomed to fail, as Andrzej quickly reacted to it in a motion that she was familiar with at this point. In a fluid move, he would allow James's blade to glance off to the side before countering and securing himself the point. Or at least, that was what would have happened had James's arm holding the sword not suddenly broken in the middle of his attack, the trajectory of his blade changing entirely as his forearm suddenly bent into an unnatural curve, first avoiding the parry, before his arm then suddenly uncurled again, driving the blade forwards like a wound spring releasing its tension. As the tip made contact with the mage's armor with a mild thudding sound, the two opponents went still for a brief moment, only to then burst out into mildly restrained laughter. "That was a cheap shot," Andrzej complained between sniggers, and shook his head a bit as his blade sank down, his tip gently clacking against the floor. "Hey, you use what you have," James gave back, briefly wiggling his mechanical arm in a smooth snake-like motion before also allowing his blade to sink down. "Water?" he then asked, with a mild tilt of his helmeted head. "I'll take it," Andrzej confirmed with a nod, dropping the blade to the floor completely before reaching up and unclasping his own helmet, pulling it off his head. James soon did the same, and with their helmets held under their arms, the two men jauntily moved over to where their bottles were waiting for them. Not far from the refreshments, the last official member of the team sat leaned against the gym's wall, a towel swung around her neck, while the long part of her freshly dyed green hair slightly stuck to her face. The piercings usually decorating Tuya's face in multiple places were absent at the moment, stored away safely in a locker, as she just briefly took a break in between her own workout sets, though she seemed to have briefly gotten distracted by the shiny scabbard of the weapon James had gotten as a present for his birthday from the Admiral, now holding the messer in both hands, as she gently unsheathed it just a little bit to look at the blade, as well as the engraving on it. She'd understood her fascination. Even if you weren't really a sword person like James and Andrzej were, the thing sure was pretty to look at, especially if you had an eye for metal craftsmanship. Though as Tuya noticed her fellow lieutenant coming closer, she quickly closed the blade back up, clearly not wanting to stare at the engraving while he was within view. Laying the sheathed blade down onto her crossed legs, she glanced up at James for a moment, obviously thinking about talking to him now that he was taking a bit of a break, though since she hesitated a bit, she was just awkwardly staring at him for a few heartbeats while he screwed his bottle open and quickly took a few swigs of water. "Something on my face?" he eventually asked, clearly noticing her hesitation in talking to him and taking it upon himself to break the ice. Tuya twitched for the fraction of a moment after being called out, though she quickly recovered and didn't look the least bit sheepish as she tilted her head up at him. "I was just wondering," she said, and shifted to sit a bit straighter, her back pressing against the wall more firmly now, as she lifted one hand to rub part of the towel against her neck. "The stuff that was in that little booklet of the Admiral, the one you made when you were a kid, I mean. How much of that could you, actually do these days?" Sheeta's ears twitched a bit, and she felt very lucky that she actually was there for the same conversation Tuya was referring to, so she wasn't totally lost as to what was going on as she listened to the exchange. James blinked, seeming surprised by the sudden question. Then he lifted a hand, briefly running it through the sweaty hair over his temple. Then he released a slow breath through hollow cheeks. "I mean, assuming money and ethics aren't any concern," he said, simultaneously setting the parameters for his reply, and also obviously stalling for time a bit as he ran through the possibilities in his mind. "Like 60 to 70-ish% maybe?" he then finally stated, which caused Sheeta's ear to lift up a bit. Although she was used to the idea that humans play with their own genetics at this point, the stuff that baby James had written into that little gift of his had still seemed rather outlandish to her in many cases. Then again, she really wasn't the expert here. "Of the genetic stuff, I mean," James then quickly added in clarification, and gave a brief chuckle. "I have literally no idea how feasible any of the mechanical augmentations are, though considering some of the stuff Curie has pulled off on their own body, I assume some of them are at least in the realm of plausibility. But you probably know more than me there." Tuya nodded. "You got that much right," she confirmed thoughtfully for a moment, bringing her fingers to her lips. "I guess the agelessness is probably out, otherwise that would be commonplace. Same thing for the regeneration. The anaerobic metabolism also sounds a bit outlandish, and I guess adapting lateral line organs is probably a bit harder than a 10-year-old imagined. And we already have the atrophy blockers, so I guess that is not a question of possibility anymore." James nodded along with her explanation, seeming to indicate she had the right instincts. "Any reason you're suddenly interested in that?" he wondered, with a curious gaze down at the woman. Tuya pondered for a moment longer, but then shook her head. "Just randomly curious," she replied. "You don't see ideas that are so specific every day. I guess I was just curious how far along we are when compared to children's fantasies." James shrugged with an amused expression. "There's a lot of things we could do if we really wanted to," he said, putting emphasis on the could. He then looked down at his mechanical arm for a movement, and another unnatural wave went through its many connected joints. "I guess so," Tuya nodded, and her gaze also briefly stuck to the prosthesis, before gliding back down to the sword on her lap. Once again, she unsheathed it just enough to look at the engraving. She looked at it for a few long seconds, before exhaling in a slightly resigned manner, and pushing it shut again, laying the blade down in front of the wall as she got back to her feet. Cracking her neck, she stretched for a moment, before giving James a wave that indicated the conversation was over before, and beginning to walk across the room. "Time to torture the rowing machine," she chuckled. James looked after her, though he was then distracted as, moments after she walked away, the door to the gym suddenly flew open. Setting herself apart from everyone else in either protective gear or gym clothes, Koko entered wearing her full uniform, her gait firm and staunch. Everyone quickly looked over to her and nodded their heads in a greeting, though with James and Andres being closest to the entrance, it was James who ultimately spoke up. "Hey, Koko," he greeted, waving with the hand of the arm holding his helmet, while the other still held onto his bottle. "How's things?" Koko stopped a few steps away from him, standing straight and respectfully as she looked at him. She briefly lifted her fist in front of her mouth and deliberately cleared her throat. "First Lieutenant Aldwin," she returned his greeting in a way that was as firm as it was hinting, causing James to slightly twitch and briefly fumble with his bottle as he quickly set it down. "Oh," he said, as he shot back up, now accompanied by everyone else who could quickly stand at attention, and he too quickly cleared his throat. "Hello, Commander." James then more properly greeted with a salute. Koko nodded, her face showing just the faintest hint of awkwardness that really was only visible to those who knew her well, as she gestured for everyone to be at ease. In the meantime, She'd had managed to at least push herself up into a sitting position, which wasn't exactly proper, but it was the best she could do right now. With the Admiral out of commission for the time being, Koko obviously had to step up a bit given her high rank on board of the Sun. Thus, it wasn't really surprising to see her come around in a more official fashion, even if it was generally still a bit of a shock to the system, now that it did finally happen. Though despite that, there was no one in the room who would have so much as thought about disrespecting Commander Coing, at a time when she actually demanded their respect for once. She'd very much included. It was easy to forget sometimes, but she was, by far, the deadliest person among them based on sheer numbers alone. Lieutenant, we just received an encrypted communication directly from the Galactic Council station. Koko proceeded to inform James, once everyone had relaxed their stance a bit. She then paused briefly, and swallowed heavily before she finally announced, "It is my honor to officially announce your appointment to an acting councilman of the current acting Galactic Council. Assuming you agree to the appointment, you will officially assume the seat of the late acting councilman Afyana on the first day of the next uniform week. You are expected to inform the acting council of your acceptance or non-acceptance of your new position before that date, and should you accept, you are also urged to hand in the necessary and supplied forms until the date of your official public appointment. If you have any questions, an official assistant of contact has been assigned to you and can be contacted at any point. Your answer is expected with great anticipation." Once she was done speaking, Koko exhaled the rest of the deep breath she had taken before the clearly rehearsed speech, and then took a fresh new one, before shifting her tone slightly to a less stiff but still professional one. "We all knew this could be coming," she said, her green eyes looking at him with held-back curiosity. "Have you decided what you're going to do?" Everyone's gaze shifted from her onto James, whose face had continuously darkened ever since it had become clear what all of this was about. There wasn't exactly a lack of options for James here. He could decline and things would continue as usual. He could take up the job and proceed things as a member of the council, trying to change it from the inside until the proper election would finally come around. Or he could accept the spot only to then immediately drop it right after officially putting in his replacement, effectively giving him the power to install almost whoever he wanted as an acting council person, or keeping himself free to continue his campaigning. Of course, Sheeta knew that he had talked to the Council of Governors back on Earth about the topic, wondering what they would want him to do. However, the answer on that front was quite clear. It would be a really, really bad look if they gave any more than a recommendation in this situation. And ultimately, it was up to James himself how he wanted to handle this matter. They could work with every decision he could make, no problem. She believed Representative Kumar's exact words had been, "We told you we'd handle it. Just do what you think gives you the best position. We've got writers for underdogs and overlords." And so, everyone remained quiet and looked at James, awaiting his answers. James closed his eyes, exhaling slowly, seemingly to gather his thoughts. Then he opened them again, his eyes holding a renewed determination now that he had fully caught up to the fact that this was actually happening. "Yeah," he said, his voice firm and clearly showing that he had made up his mind. "Yeah, I made up my mind." James stared into the mirror, tilting his head from side to side as he inspected his face and the freshly shaved edges of his short beard, making sure he hadn't accidentally put a kink into it or left some hairs out of place. His skin was still slightly red just underneath the stubble, as well as around its edges, but he knew that would settle soon enough if he just let it rest for a moment. Once he was satisfied with his inspection, he took a half step back from the mirror and instead turned his attention towards his shirt, making sure it was smooth and free of wrinkles. The only ones he found were those that formed right over the thin harness he wore just underneath the shirt, which housed the counterweights balancing out the excess weight of his right arm. Nodding to himself, as he saw the otherwise unblemished surface, he looked to the side, grabbing a coat hanger that hung from the handle of one of the cabinets. He quickly freed his suit jacket from the hanger, and slid it over his shoulders, pulling his hem into place in front of his chest. Once that was done, he briefly glanced down, his eyes landing on the pair of black gloves that lay prepared for him on a small counter next to the sink. He hesitated briefly, and then reached out his right hand. The mechanical appendage moved slowly as he went to pick up the concealing cover, its dark polymeric skin glistening gently underneath the room's lights. A few moments, the grey hand hovered over the gloves, hesitating to pick them up. Then James released a huffing breath and quickly grabbed them, only to then immediately shove them into a nearby drawer, getting them out of his sight. Nearly throwing the drawer shut, he then paused briefly once again, his eyes still sticking to his own hand. He flexed his fingers briefly, forming a fist in both directions, both naturally possible and not. Once the display that would have likely been slightly disturbing to the uninitiated was over, he instead moved his hand over to his other arm, opening the cuffs of his suit and shirt to allow himself to push up their sleeves a bit, revealing his left forearm. Of course, he was looking for the 5 deep marks left across it by a certain feline, and, as always, a gentle smile crept across his face as his eyes ran across the dark scratches sticking out from his pale skin. For a fleeting moment, he seriously wondered if there was any way he could wear a short-sleeved suit, somehow, in order to show the scars off just like he planned to show the hand of his other arm, though he quickly had to admit to himself that even he, with very limited interest in the topic, was still not quite ready to commit that sort of fashion crime, especially not considering who would be in attendance. With one last sigh, he quickly pulled his sleeve back down and closed the cuffs back up before turning away from the mirror and moving to the bathroom's exit with one last tug on his jacket. The door slid open for him, allowing him to step out into his cabin, where 2 people were already awaiting his arrival. "I still cannot believe I missed you wearing a dress." He just caught the tail end of the ongoing conversation, with Nia obviously lamenting the fact that she had been unconscious for that specific event, as she spoke to Shida. Her complaining went unanswered though, as both women quickly turned their attention towards James once he stepped into the room proper, their eyes quickly scrutinizing his appearance for any possible flaws he might have missed. Just like him, they too were both dressed up in their Sunday's best, fully prepared for any kind of eyes on them. Unlike she did during his birthday, Shida did not stick to a human idea of fashion this time, much to Nia's obvious disappointment. Instead of her velveteen dress, she was wearing a complicated getup that was painstakingly constructed of different silvered and gilded plates that were held together by small links of chain and ultimately transitioned into larger stretches of speckled mail whenever it needed to be more flexible than interlocking plates would allow for. Meanwhile, the bottom part of her outfit was provided by black leather pants, which were intricately accented by thin golden chains that wrapped snugly around her legs in a pattern that was reminiscent of her natural stripes. The outfit had been very kindly, as well as against the payment of a large sum that was likely exceeding its actual value by almost 2 times according to Shida, provided to her by one of the soldiers serving on the Mintahaji. Luckily, the purchase seemed to have been at least somewhat worth it, since James could almost taste the supreme confidence that Shida exuded while wearing it, and he could tell she most certainly found it to be a much better fit for herself than the dress she had mostly worn out of novelty alone. Nia, on the other hand, didn't have to jump through quite as many hoops for her own outfit, as she simply dug into her own personal collection, which Admiral Krieger had very helpfully brought along, as she embarked to join up with them on Gerra-Litten. It was a fancy dress of white and gold which she had quite obviously picked in order to coordinate her colours with the metals of Shida's clothes. The white formed the main bulk of the high-neck, sleeveless dress, with the gold generally taking more of a supporting role in the form of reflective markings along its hems and around its sides, one of which was opened up just below the hips in order to give her legs some more room to move in the otherwise rather snugly fit piece of clothing. As she leaned back with her hands pressing flatly into the mattress just behind her, a crutch lay not far away from one of them, put aside as it was not currently necessary, but very much utilised whenever she walked around. The events of the recent past had not left her entirely without marks that would take more time to fade than they had right now, some more visible than others. After a long moment of inspection, James seemed to have passed muster, as both women briefly nodded to themselves, and Nia briefly twisted her body and lifted one of her arms to reach for something that was currently obscured from James's vision by her form. After a moment of audible rummaging, she turned her front back to him and lifted her hand, presenting a puffy brush, which she wiggled gently between her fingers. "Want me to touch you up?" she offered, a very gentle hint of lingering weakness hidden just underneath her voice. Even if it was far too faint to cause any problems right that moment, it stung James a bit that he picked up on it at all. Still, he didn't dare to make a big deal out of it and simply shook his head slightly, while smiling at his sister. "I don't think I need it for now," he said with a casual tone. "I would probably just smudge it. Maybe later though, when the cameras will be watching." Nia nodded and put the brush away again, seeming satisfied enough with that answer. As she moved to put it away, James managed to get a good look at her left forearm, her eyes clinging to the tattooed copy of his scars decorating it. The same was true for Sheeda's as she stepped up to his side and lifted her arm to present him with the silver shape of his sword, holding it up with a clear expectation that he would take it. The copy of the marks left by her own claws proudly peeked out from under the mail sleeve as it slid down her arm from its own weight. Smiling, James grabbed the sword sheath with maybe slightly more force than strictly necessary, causing a mild clink as the metal bones collided with it, just before he quickly fastened the thing to a prepared holder on his belt. Once it was in place, his left hand settled on the end of his hilt, resting relaxed as his fingers gently wrapped around his form. "Shall we?" he asked, after releasing a very brief exhale, looking at both of them individually. Nia and Sheeda both nodded, with the former reaching over to grab her crutch before she slightly sluggishly moved to stand up, while the latter very briefly laid her head down on James's shoulder, nuzzling up for a second before pulling back and taking her place at his side. For the time being, Nia didn't need to rely on her crutch just yet, simply carrying it in her right hand as she joined up with them, though her gait was still far slower than her usually tight pace, meaning that they took some time to make their way through the halls of the sun. All the while, any soldiers or other occupants of the ship gave them a wide berth to make extra sure they wouldn't block their way. Still, it didn't take them too long altogether before they made their way onto one of the elevators, which transported them into one of the lower gravity outer levels of the ship, which they then made their way through to reach one of the large open holding areas, which had been cleared specifically for today's event. As the large door opened for the three of them, their eyes quickly fell upon a colourful group standing inside. Although their arrival was clearly anticipated, everyone didn't quite immediately drop everything that they were doing as they stepped inside, allowing them to catch the tail ends of a couple of conversations. "And you are sure this trip will take us just a few hours, even though we have to move past the galaxy's core?" Ambassador Tharivel asked, in a mixture of curiosity and excitement. The large Parasine stood on eye level with Conglorch and absent-mindedly clacked her beak as she awaited the man's answer. Conglorch nodded his large head and released an amused bellow. "It is the fastest ship in the human fleet, quite possibly in the entire galaxy," he confirmed for the representative of their galactic neighbours. "If they say we will be there in no time, you can believe them." Meanwhile, not far from them, the large brown form of Moore sat on the ground, deeply bent down in order to hold a somewhat direct conversation with one of her oldest friends among the chaos of the surrounding people. Although he didn't catch whatever question had brought it on as a reply, James could see Quiz as they were signing up on the large Raphaelite. "Shook things up far more than I could ever imagine to, and now is not the time to hang on to previous ideas. We can't afford to keep jaunting along while our opposition is setting up for a sprint," they explained in decisive motions of their short arms. "And besides, all eyes in the entire galaxy will be on this. I cannot conceive of a better way to get the knowledge of me and my candidacy out there, I am sure." Moore looked very much concerned about her friend. However, she did not argue with them, as she simply nodded in understanding of their standpoint. At the same time, on the other end of the crowd, a very differently weighted conversation took place, as Commander Giranora crossed her arms, her ears laying low as her tail swayed mildly in irritation. Couldn't even muster as much as a simple assistant or something? She said, with clear displeasure, and released an annoyed huff while her lips twitched from dammed-up emotion. You would think having their fleet decimated would bring up a bit of a reaction, but no! Long as they keep everything as is, they're happy. James's eyes swung over to her for a moment. However, they quickly became caught on the one she was conversing with instead of her. A head of long and voluminous black hair was the first thing he saw, before his eyes moved down and ran across her prim and proper uniform, decorated with all 4 stars. One of her arms was held in a sling, clearly not yet entirely healed from all the damage it had taken in the exchange of fire. Yet despite that, both of her weapons were, as always, proudly portrayed on her hip. On her left was the large pistol, with a barrel almost as long as the Admiral's forearm, and a smooth white paint job that was finished with details of thin gold that seemed to grow across it like ivy. On her right was the large cutlass with a golden hilt and a scabbard that was just as black as her hair and uniform. Moving even further down, his eyes got caught on her left leg. Hidden underneath the leg of her pants and a long pair of boots, nothing seemed unusual about it as she simply stood there. However, he knew what lay underneath. His mechanical hand clenched into a fist for a moment, as he released a slow breath. Well, unlike us, they have an acting council member of their own, Admiral Krieger replied to Jiranora's annoyed tirade, her voice casual and calming. Why send someone along with us and possibly cause a scene when they have someone right in the thick of it already? Jirionora didn't seem quite pleased with that, and averted her eyes while clacking her lips. However, any possible remark on the matter was left out as she then lifted her eyes at the approaching newcomers, and quickly joined by everyone else. Truly quite the colourful party that had come together here, and even more would be waiting to meet up with them at their goal, once they made their way there. Fashionably on time. His mother was the first to greet James and his company, turning towards him with her injured arm strapped close to her chest. Her healthy left arm, however, sunk top the hilt of her sword, much like his was positioned, as she pushed that side of her hip slightly outwards. The galaxy is waiting with bated breath. Their saint and grim reaper is missing in their hearts as well as their headlines. Ready to once again show them who you really are? The room fell quiet, as several pairs of eyes were directed his way, everyone once again awaiting his answer. James released a single laugh and nodded his head, before looking up with a confident smile. Yeah, he said, his eyes gliding along the gathered friends, colleagues, family, and dignitaries. But this time, I'm not coming alone.